Welcome to the Taos Institute's Relational Research Network video series. In this series, we explore research from a relational perspective. We hear from people working with a relational research process and learn about related values, concepts, and practices. To start, here are some of our ideas. Research from a relational perspective embodies a philosophical and co-creative stance. It is thus not a method, per se, but rather a collaborative way of being. Engaging from this perspective entails an ethical responsiveness to a focus of inquiry. Recognizing that reality is created through language and social structures means it can also be recreated. Relational research is a process that is attentive to broader relations and interactions. The purpose is to expand possibilities and co-create transformative potentials. We hope you enjoy the series and invite you to join in the conversation. Christopher E. Westill Kinman, A Conversation with Papusa Molina. Rhizomatic Research. Christopher E. Westill Kinman is a family therapist, photographer, poet, and musician. He lives in Abbotsford, British Columbia, in Canada. Throughout his whole life, Christopher has felt a strong connection with what Gregory Bateson calls the creatura, the world of all that is living, including those realms of relationship that sustain all that is living. In this conversation, he discusses the concept of rhizome as a system that has no beginning or end.
Hi, I'm so honored to be this evening with Chris Kinman to talk with him, to have a little conversation about his work. This is part of the Relational Research Network series of interviews with people who do relational, collaborative, dialogic type of research. And I would like to start, Chris, by asking, what is that you would like to tell people about you and your work?
Well, you used the, in talking about this, we talked about the term relational. And I don't think there's any other kind of work. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of an ontological thing as opposed to an ethical thing. It's not just we need to work relationally. There is no other way to work, and we're deluding ourselves if we think there's something else. So I'm really interested in the relationships that sustain people, and the relationships that sustain people in relationships. And talking with people about those things and honoring those things. And so whatever the work is, whether it's, I'm working with an individual or a family or a group or whether I'm teaching, it's the sense that the world is composed of relationships, and we sustain each other through those relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I want to find out what those are.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, Chris, how did you get to this? How to start thinking in this way? Do you want to talk a little bit about your process of how did you get to this idea that everything is relational and sure, there's nothing outside a relationship?
Yeah, well, there's many lines of relationship that led to that.
Okay, it makes sense.
And it led to a kind of an honesty about that, a realization that this is the case. I mean, and I go back to my childhood with my mother, who saw the world that way. I go back to my previous career, which was a pastor, and certain theological understandings, which I kind of moved away from and then found a way to revisit, without having to necessarily believe in a big God, but to be able to revisit some of those and to see relationality at work. I'll give you an example. And this is in my dissertation, but there's this image of the Trinity that comes from Russia. And that Trinity is composed, when you see the image, there are three beings around a table.
Okay.
And they're all three of them, you can't tell what gender they are.
Okay.
And there's no one bigger than the other, smaller. They're all very similar, and they're androgynous as well.
Okay.
And you see these beings around the table, and there's three beings, but at the front, there's no one in the front, so you can see, right? There's no one there, but there's a little square, and the story is that square used to hold a mirror.
Okay.
So that the concept of the Trinity, the concept of this, how people saw these kind of building blocks of life, wasn't three. It included the fourth element.
Okay.
And it included the observer. It included the living beings, whoever that living being might be. So as you looked into that image, you would see the three members of the Trinity, but you would see yourself too. And so even that is such a relational view of divinity that includes the living creatures. And so, I mean, even that kind of things comes back to me. And of course, goes to my long-term reading of Bateson, which Bateson challenged us to think in relational ways. And Deleuze powerfully emphasized the importance of relations, and that there's nothing else. That's what it is. And of course, perhaps the biggest influence with me was Lynn Hoffman.
Lynn,
and
yeah, I know.
Lynn also saw life as composed of nothing else but of relations, and it used to come out in the most pragmatic of ways, and she had this way of saying these beautiful statements, like one of them, and she used to say was, if you're stuck, add more bodies.
Add more bodies, yeah, I remember.
Right, and it wasn't voices, by the way, it's bodies. And the bodies could speak, or they don't have to speak. They could, but add more bodies. And she would practice this, and she would find ways to bring more and more people into the conversation. And I think she was a huge influence for me in that way. Yeah.
Yes. And as you were describing kind of this kind of line of ancestry for you,
yes.
Your mother, Deleuze, Bateson, Lynn Hoffman, you also talk about this Trinity image that is in your dissertation. I remember the first time you shared with me a draft of your dissertation, and I was fascinated. I love your poetic voice. I love what you do. And I couldn't leave it. I couldn't put it away. I just wanted to read it and keep searching and sometimes I will get lost in the images. So tell me a little bit about how did you end up writing this quote unquote piece of research? What took you to write your dissertation? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I like to say it didn't take me long to write the dissertation if you look at it just as writing a dissertation. But whenever anyone says, wow, you did it fast, I says, yeah, it took a lifetime. the dissertation is built around a number of concepts, but they're relational ones. And I decided I wanted to explore ideas that were important to us in relationship to a river that was important to those of us who lived in this area where I lived. The Great Fraser River, or the Stolo as it's called. The Stolo people are, they called themselves the Stolo, and the river's called the Stolo. So the people and the river are one, and you don't make a distinction between them. You cannot talk about the river without talking about the people, and you can't talk about the people without talking about the river. And I had the honor and privilege of being able to work with one particular nation for just under 30 years, the Chehalis First Nation. And they were connected to the, where the actual community is now, to the Harrison, what's called the Harrison River, which is also connected to the Fraser River. And the river, if you think of British Columbia, if you look at a map, there's the interior of British Columbia and there's the coast. And in order to travel between the two, you didn't go straight up the Fraser because it is just too violent. The river's too violent. So you instead they would go up the Harrison, what we call the Harrison River, and so they would go by Chehalis. So the Chehalis people, for thousands of years, determined who was going to travel and who wasn't going to travel between the interior and the coast. So they ended up becoming a very politically powerful people. And over the years, they taught me this in little bits and pieces, you know, and I began to realize again that even our politics are relational and at least their politics are intimately connected to landscape and to places and to the salmon that run up the river and all of that. So I wanted to explore the ideas around education and the ideas around the kind of work that we do through the lens of our relationship with the Fraser River. And so that's what I did. And so as you travel with me in the dissertation, we start at Chehalis First Nation, and then we literally move and travel into the interior, up the watershed, not just the river, but up the watershed. And we stop in various places and we reflect upon ideas that are connected to those places in the river. So the relational work to me is certainly not limited to human beings. And I think we got to be clear on that. And by the way, I remember conversations with you when we talked about the idea of rhizome, for instance, and you talked about rhizome included the rocks and the birds and the stars and everything. And I never forgot those moments, because with you also, and maybe it's that indigenous element of your work, but there's this, you can't separate yourself and your work from those beautiful elements that we're in relationship with. And so it ties me to you as well.
Yeah, I remember many of those conversations.
Yeah. And so we learn from each other, and I learn from you, and I learned the intensity of those relations, and how we must never minimize them, and that we have to come back to life with them as much as we can. And I do that in my work as well. I'm often talking about, especially when I work with children and young people, talking about their connections to this land, to the waters, and they want to talk about it. And often what they think, what we call depression, is tied into how they see what's been happening to the land and to the waters and to the air and to the animals and the birds and the forests and the rivers. And we can have those conversations, and they're liberating.
Chris, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, okay, if I was one of your students and I wanted to do this type of research, quote unquote, that you do, how would I learn it? What would you teach me about it? What would I need to do to think kind of in this way in which your work is written?
Well, I do this with students, right? Because I assist students with their thesis and capstone projects. And one of the things I'm wanting to do with them is engage in conversations about the relationships that are important to them, and to explore those things. And when they have a quote topic that they're interested in, I want to know the roots of that interest. I want to know the elements that tie them to this, and I want to know the stories and the lineages and the ancestries that are connected. And if possible, I want to go generations into that too, not just into one life, right? The indigenous peoples often talk here, anyway, I don't know about elsewhere, about 7 generations.
Yes.
And, can we imagine our work as being 7 generations long? But I'll explore that with the students. And so we always enter into those relational conversations. So whatever the topic is, we need to understand the relationships that have made that topic important to these students, and to find some way of articulating that, and in academia of following that, and to realize, by the way, also when they write their papers and they have their references, they have the bibliography, I tell them it's not a list of authorities, it's a list of relationships. These are
that's
people you have read, that you are now tied into them, and they are now tied into you.
No, that's a beautiful image that I haven't thought about it. Yeah, I talk with my students how the dialogues they establish with the books, the articles, whatever, the movies, films, but I never thought about that concretely into the relationship they establish with these sources.
That's why I see it as the relational element is ontological, in the sense that it's not just an ethics, it's a world. It's a way of understanding our world, and that way it's epistemological as well. But it's it unpacks a world and those relationships that make up this world. And I like to think about that with all of my students' research. It's not like there's some research that's relational and some that isn't. There may be that, but what's happening is they're just not acknowledging the relations, if that's the case. So whatever the topic is they're doing, and even whatever approach they're doing, how do we acknowledge and bring to life and honor the relationships that enable this document to be produced? And so I'm always having those conversations.
And right now, when you talk about how what are the relationships that enable this piece of research or this book or this article to emerge. I was thinking about how then do you quote unquote give back to those communities and to those relationships that allow you to generate this piece of work?
Well, that's your indigenous thinking. Because that's with my experience in working with these communities, that's the question that they ask. And when I would work with young people in these communities, when they would first go hunting with the elders, and they would shoot a deer, they weren't allowed to eat that deer. They had to give away that deer to the elders and to those who needed it. And so an accomplishment of any kind demanded a giving back, and it was built into the cultural ways. And that's what I think of when you ask that, when you make that idea, that comment. We have to think about that. You know, we have to realize that in the language of gifts, which is a term Lynn Hoffman gave to me, is a language of relations. And these gifts move in lines of relation, but they must continue to move. A gift never stops. It has to flow. So once it's been given, it has to continue being given. And this is what happens with the deer, you know. And there's all these ceremonies when you shoot the deer too, and thanking for its life. And every spring at Stehelas, they would have the first salmon ceremony. So the first salmon that have given themselves to the community are eaten and shared. And so I think your idea is your question is a very important one.
So I give it back to you. How when you do your research, this very non-traditional, very relational research, how do you give back? How is this piece given back?
Yes, it's a question I'm still exploring.
Okay.
One of the things about whenever you write a dissertation or a major paper, you wonder if anyone's reading it. And you've given it out there to the world, and you realize that the response that the response that comes back from that is unclear. Is you don't always know it. And maybe that's how response to our gifts are always, is that we have a sense that we've given them out, but we're not sure what that influence will be. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I think that's the part of the mystery. You know, the giving out of the document, and it feels like it's a giving back, but it's a mysterious giving back.
Yeah. I right now, you were saying this about giving back, I was thinking, as you describe kind of your lineage and your ancestry, they are not in this level of living right now. None of them. But you have given them to so many people. No, I can remember the film you did about Lynn Hoffman. That is a beautiful film that is there in YouTube for anybody to see if they want it. I remember that I read Deleuze because of you. So the giving back, and this is just what I'm reflecting in this moment, the giving back is not necessarily directly to the people that give you, and
Yes.
this idea of the gift, but it's almost like paying forward, no? It's like you give it to other people and you don't know what is going to be, where it's going to go and how it's going to go, no?
Well, you don't know, and you put it out there, and for me personally, I've had to deal with, as I've told you, some health issues, and they've made me think about certain things, and they make you think about the relations that sustain you and that keep you going, and I don't have I don't have what it takes these days to have the same kind of energy to create things and do the work as I used to do. And so I have to somehow trust that it is that what has been given to me is continuing to be given, and that we all become part of these rivers, and at some point we're not even sure what we gave and what others have given. It just all starts to flow into one. In my dissertation, the last chapter, I visit Vancouver because the Fraser River comes out just the south end of Vancouver. And we talk about a number of different things at that point. But one of the things we reflect upon is the river doesn't end. It moves out into the flows of the Georgia Strait and into the flows of the Pacific Ocean and their end throughout all the world. And so life and death start to have profound relational meanings with that. The river as it flows can't stay that way forever. It ends up moving into other flows. And eventually it's hard to know which flow we're in. And I like that. So that to me is a certain spirituality that comes out of this, that I like to explore with people. Yeah.
Yes, you took me so many places when you say the river never ends. You know, it took me to that phrase from Harleen Anderson that says, the conversations never end, they are just interrupted, you know?
And they don't begin either, by the way. That's the other thing you realize.
Yeah, it's a continuous flow. And I wonder, as researchers, what is that we need to learn about this flowing of the river that never ends, that is just interrupted, or more than interrupted, it merges into, as you say, into the ocean, and from there, who knows where, travels, and the whole planet, you know? And I was thinking, what did we need to learn as researchers, and what did we need to learn in academia about these images that you share with us? What do you think that is the gift that you would like? If somebody asks you, what is the gift that you would like to give? What is the gift that you would like to leave for the people in academia about this way of looking at life and looking at research?
Well, maybe the best way to answer is that what you want to live is partly the idea of the leave is partly the idea of the gift.
Okay.
Because if I identify those gifts, I'm limiting it too much.
Okay.
And I'm trying to control it by saying this is what's going to come from it, instead of realizing that it's so much bigger than us, and that we are part of it, and we enter those flows. So when I think of a language of gifts, I think when gifts flow from people to people, or from people to river, or whatever, they transform and they become something other. And we don't know in advance what that other will be. And this is where it ties into beautifully in research. I always feel that if when we're doing research, if we know what the outcome is going to be, why bother? What's that got to do with research?
Okay.
I mean, that's already written.
Okay.
That's not new. So in research, we have to be open to how these gifts shapeshift as they move, and how they become something else. And so when we are doing our research, in whatever capacity we're doing it, in whatever model we're following or approach we're following, we have to become aware that these ideas shift and move and become something else. And we can never know in advance what they'll be. To me, one of the ideas about the gift exchange that's always been important to me is that it shapeshifts. And I think research does too. And I think all good research, we don't know. And we don't go into it knowing what the answer is going to be. If we do, we're not doing research. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Makes complete sense. It's like this conversation, Chris. I didn't know where it was going to take us. I knew it was going to be wonderful and beautiful, and it has taken me into even rethinking what I think I'm doing as dialogic research, as collaborative research.
Right.
And I thank you, Chris. And as always, talking with you, having a small conversation with you, a few minutes with you, inspires me. And I hope that this conversation inspires other people about what you say. Life is relations. And thank you very much for accepting to have this conversation with me. Is there something that you would like to say to kind of close this moment of conversation?
Yes, I want to practice the relational element of it.
Okay.
And I want to thank you. I want to thank you for years of conversation that we've shared together that form us. And that even if we haven't talked for a while, we come back together and we join in the flows.
Yeah.
And so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Papusa Molina and Christopher E. Westel Kinman. More about Christopher is available at www.taosinstitute.net/Christopher-J-Kinman. Please join in the conversation. What captured your attention in this video? How do you think these ideas reflect a relational orientation to research? Please leave a comment on this YouTube page or join our community at www.taosinstitute.net/relational-research-network. There you can find a lot more information and resources. We thank the Relational Research Network leadership team for the vision and dedication to making this video series come to life.